Content warning. Please be aware that this video discusses triggering topics like rape, pedophilia, abuse and other disturbing topics. Therapists of Reddit, what was your biggest, I know I'm not supposed to judge you but holy sh*t moment? I was counseling a 13-year-old girl for anxiety and she reported sexual abuse from her stepdad. I called her mom and told her mother I needed to call Child Protective Services. Turns out that CPS was already aware and the abuse was first reported around the patient's age 7. Mom was aware of the abuse and stayed with her husband anyway. It was a complicated situation, and it wasn't. How could she not do more to protect her daughter? Sorry lady. I'm judging. My professor once shared what a patient said that made her quit her job. I didn't rape my daughter, she liked it. The daughter was 6. She couldn't take it anymore. She worked in a rehabilitation center for people who have been sentenced for serious crimes and were forced to get mental help. Really difficult job and this pushed her over the edge. I work at a residential group home. We had a kid who we had admitted about 4 months prior, when in a family session they mentioned they had parasites. I'm like, what? Mom goes, oh yeah, our whole family has them, we don't believe in getting rid of them since they're part of our biological ecosystem, and I'm just dumbstruck. We spent 3 weeks afterwards convincing this family it was an infectious disease concerns as other residents have fecal eating behaviors and various other unsanitary issues that could cause a unit spread. 3 weeks of education, planning, and worst of all convincing this kid and mother that their IQ wouldn't drop because they had agreed to irradiate the parasites. Lots of CBT work, but Jesus, it took way longer than any of my team expected. Once had a patient whose wife shook their baby to death. He wanted help reconnecting with his wife. At the time I was a young father of a newborn myself, and he triggered a lot of fear in me for my own child, a deep loathing of his spouse, and pity, how pathetic, kind, for the patient. I tried for 3 sessions, met his spouse and everything before handing the case over to my supervisor, who knew about my initial reactions, and tried to help me through it. Unfortunately, it ended up being more about my feelings than his, and I was new to the profession at the time. These things are expected to crop up from time to time, but I was still taken aback by my own reactions. I work with kiddos who have experienced some kind of abuse/trauma. 90% of my clients have been sexually abused. I have a lot of holy shit moments, but not from judgment of my clients but from what happened to them. I've had clients whose father made them help him dismember mom's body after dad murdered her in front of them. I've had clients under the age of 8 who have been sex trafficked. I've had clients who have been forced to film torture porn. I have holy shit moments all the time. It's not often I get to talk about my profession, but here goes. I was working at a drug and alcohol rehabilitation center and had a client come in who was a self-proclaimed drug lord. As we worked together, he told me about his history. Included in this history was how he got to where he was currently at. During the conversation, this man admitted to selling his sister into sex slavery, forcibly injecting her with several sedatives and narcotics, and having several people teach her a lesson. What this meant, he never shared. He told this story with a blank face, smiling only when he recalled the good times, which he referred to as times when he had enough heroin to get through the day. I'm not sure where he is at now, but this man inspired me to work with victims of sex trafficking, because not only do they deal with the stigma of selling their bodies, they often manage drug addictions. People would honestly be floored if they realized how many people were addicted to chemicals that they were forcibly given. Therapist here. I don't think I've ever judged clients. My job is to understand them and their experiences and help them make the improvements they are ready to make. But I have very directly made my thoughts clear about choices, especially choices parents make about their kids. This probably comes off as judgment depending on the client's insecurity about the topic. One example was telling parents of a child I was working with a severe mood disorder, that had made both suicidal and homicidal threats and attempts, that it did not seem like a good idea to buy the young kid a gun, especially the week after the mother spent the session sharing her fears that the child would murder her. I was once in my psychiatrist's office, a bi-monthly, 15 minutes med check. She asked me what was going on, more as conversation. I told her that in the last 6 weeks, my 3 elders, aunt and 2 uncles, I was guardian/conservator for had died, one right after the other. My wife had a heart attack. My daughter attempted suicide. And my mom broke her hip and had laid on her floor for a week before being found. She drank and ate from the dog's bowls. I got that call within 10 minutes of setting up the last funeral. She stopped the meeting, got on the phone with a therapist in the office next to her and had her postpone her next meeting to speak with me. I was so fucked up, I had no idea. I think she saved my life. I feel like a lot of the comments saying that they never judge their clients might be working in voluntary services or they've been very fortunate in their client base. Judgment isn't an inherently bad thing. It's how we know that murdering people is wrong. So when a convicted pedophile client told me, "Nothing gets me going like a pair of little girls' worn panties," you better believe I judged the fuck out of him. I continued to work with him and I treated him with compassion and respect because he's a human being worthy of both. I did my job because I'm a professional. But I can't honestly say that I didn't judge him. I judged that he should never be around children. I judged that he is not yet ready for change. I judged that his access to his own daughter should be closely supervised. That's a lot of judgments. Understanding your own inherent biases and how they influence your work is a very important part of training and practice. Lots of people discussing pedophilia as an example of the toughest stuff to not judge despite our training. I haven't yet treated a pedophile, thankfully. At least not an identified one. I did run a men's anger management group though, and some of those men had done some terrible things to women. Most of them I found ways to like and admire for their positive aspects, but there were 2 guys in that group I just could never find unconditional positive regard for. One guy basically never spoke in group. He would give one-word answers and occasionally just discuss how unfair the system was to him. I worked really hard to open him up and find things to connect over, but he never opened up to me or the group. He left the group after he strangled his girlfriend and went to jail. She survived, thankfully. The other left group early, routinely, showed up late, participated minimally, and similarly never wanted to open up honestly. He left early one group after we had discussed him staying to the end and threatened me when I told him he wasn't going to get credit for attendance, something the court required. Oddly, I eventually moved into the apartment below him, completely without knowledge, and listened to him scream at his girlfriend and break shit while I called the cops. I judge these men. They're shitty. Maybe they're redeemable, but redemption requires self-exploration and they both refused to do so. It's worth noting how differently I felt about them than so many others in the group, men I found ways to help and admire and respect even in spite of their awful behavior in the past. When I was a teenager, I lived in a very emotionally and mentally abusive household. I know people don't take that stuff seriously, but it was so bad that I was later diagnosed with PTSD from a psychiatrist. Anywho, my abusive parents and I got in a verbal fight in the car. My stepdad stopped the car and told me, "Get out, we're leaving you on the highway." I wasn't scared because I knew I could just call the police, say I was an abandoned child, and they'd get in loads of trouble, so I said, "Sounds good," and got out. My mom then came out and started attacking me. I refused to get back in the car after the attack, so my stepdad got out, dragged me by the hair, called me a bipolar bitch, and threw me in. They made me see a therapist. They told her that I jumped out of a moving car and then I attacked my mom when she was trying to help. This therapist didn't believe anything I said and tried getting me to take bipolar meds. I knew I wasn't bipolar, I was being abused, and I knew that the anger and sadness I felt was normal for my situation. She glared at me and said, "You're not nearly as smart as you think you are." I refused to say a word in any of our therapy sessions after that. I would just go in, sit down, and she'd make snarky sarcastic remarks for a few minutes then dismiss me. She wasn't trying to help me, she was trying to help my parents. I moved out when I was 18, went to college all on my own with no financial help from my family, got a job and left the country to be as far from them as possible. I'm on antidepressants for my PTSD, and luckily the therapists Eve had since my teenage years have been nothing like that horrible woman, but it still upsets me deeply thinking about it. When I was underage, I got caught with a drink on Bourbon Street and got a minor in possession. I was telling my therapist about it, and said that the police caught me with a hand grenade in New Orleans. He didn't realize that a hand grenade was a type of drink, and it was funny to watch him try to process that his patient might have just casually told him that he had been caught with a fragmentation grenade. He took a big long pause, and said, "Where did you even find a grenade?" I realized the misunderstanding quickly and corrected him. But for a moment he definitely was thinking, "Holy shit, how do I deal with this?" Well, I quit my last therapist because I made him cry uncontrollably. He tried not to, but he just couldn't hold it back. I felt guilty and won't see him anymore. I think he may have lost a child before. I described watching my aunt grieve over her son's body. I felt so much pain losing him, but was explaining how watching my aunt was dramatically worse. The details about her is what made him lose it. I could tell he was reliving something inside his own head. I've spent my fair share of time in the ward, but I'm no therapist. There's an understanding that we're all a little fucked up in there, so we really try not to judge each other, most of us, anyways, but every once in a while you get those people who are just a different level of crazy. Now, I was on the ward for a suicide attempt, and it wasn't exactly a secret. You can usually pick out within the first few minutes who's there for finding the end of their rope and who's there because it's better in jail. But then there are the ones who are there because there is no safer place for them to be, and you're usually lucky to see them because they spend most of their time isolated and doped. Well, I was lucky enough to meet one of them right before he got doped and isolated. He was such a nice guy that I assumed he was an attempter, like me. You tend to find a lot of the best qualities in people after they've tried to end their life. With this gentleman, that was very much the case. I saw the best in him. "Can I take your plate for you?" We have to tell him no, you're not supposed to be anything except self-sufficient on the ward. "Can I do your laundry for you?" "Can I wash these dishes before we send them back to the cafeteria?" A lot of this was going on, and after 3 days of it, it was definitely becoming apparent that his typical concoction of meds had fully worn off and he was getting snippy about it. Well, my first experience with extreme bipolar disorder went a little like this. "May I sit next to you? I'm a little tense and would love a conversation to get my mind off of it." "Sure thing, B. I'm gonna finish this pudding and put a show on. What would you like to watch?" "Oh, nothing. Hey, have you ever tried to hurt yourself?" "Yeah, I have, it's why I'm in here." "Why didn't it work?" "Well, I stopped myself and drove here after I caught a glimpse of what it would do to my dad if he found me." "I see. Well, they won't let me have anything in my room, but watch this." He hands me the end of a long strand of toilet paper. "You hold that end and just watch." Now as I'm holding it I already have this idea in my head that this guy is actively trying to hurt himself, so I'm a bit curious to see what he's doing, but I'm also a bit paranoid that he may have given up on hurting himself and is now targeting someone else. But as I sit there watching him twist this toilet paper and fold it in on itself, I recognize what he's created as the start of a noose, and it dawns on me. He's trying to teach me how to hang myself. I still think about that guy. I wonder what he's like day to day when he's regular. All I ever saw was this overly exuberant bubbly personality which was tailored to make people think he wasn't as crazy as he really was. He hurt a couple of nurses that night, and the day after his noose creation, he was isolated to his room for the remainder of my stay. I work in mental health and have worked in acute and crisis settings for the majority of my career. The most notable event I experienced was when a young person had presented with significant ongoing suicidal ideation who was dealing with a lot of shit. I spent a lot of time with them, mostly de-escalation and working out what the plan should be moving forward. One of their parents came in a little while later and I had the opportunity to speak to them about where their child was and what had been going on, with their consent of course. Midway through me trying to explain some of the psychological constructs and ways the parent could help, they said to me, "Is this going to take much longer? I have a show to go and watch." All I can say is, I never judge my patients, I have never walked their path or viewed the world through their eyes. But the people around them who perpetuate the suffering of the people I work with through ignorance, malice and selfishness, I judge them. I currently have a young female client that is struggling with homelessness, a history of trauma, sexual abuse, etc. She's not handling these things well, as can be expected. Grandmother, who is her only support, keeps kicking the 10-year-old out of her house, making her homeless at 10, for acting out, and told me she can't understand why client won't just act right. Lady. Are you serious? There was a client, a young teenager that was hearing voices to hurt himself. He had multiple crisis calls and was admitted several times to crisis centers for observation until he got prescribed meds and was starting to show improvement. He was starting to disclose that he may have been gay and was stressed out because his father was old school religious and a pillar of the community. The young man was recommended to go to treatment start in a facility to keep him acclimate to meds and just to give him some coping skills and all that. His father pulled him out AMA and refused to allow him to continue medication. He also discontinued his therapy for a more religious approach. 3 months later he completed his suicide. I see that father around and I want to fuck him up. I wish I could. I'm a psychotherapist on an adult inpatient unit, so things rarely faze me. I purposely do inpatient because the thought of seeing people for years at a time bores me. I've been kicked, spit on, seen a lot of nude people, but I help pull people back from their darkest points. It's pretty awesome. My theory is everyone has a story of how they got there. Even a pedophile. That being said, I had a patient that was having consensual sex with her uncle. Very wealthy, society-type people. She went very in-depth about the relationship. That one weirded me out. I'm a dude. I was brutally raped multiple times between the ages of 7 and 10. My one and only attempt to try to get help from a therapist was one of the most awful experiences of my life. I attempted to get help in my early 20s. Upon first going in, I was asked what had happened to me, after explaining a basic outline of the abuse. I could already see that she was very dismissive and seemed not to really believe me. She then asked about my relationship status. At the time I was in a long-term relationship with a woman who had 2 kids, boys. Upon finding this out, she immediately demanded the names and address of my girlfriend, names of the kids, and said she would be immediately getting in touch with social services to ensure that I wasn't abusing them. I can't put into words just how much that destroyed me mentally, that she could obviously see something in me that I couldn't see. That somehow she was certain that I would be an abuser. I started to cry. She told me to pull myself together. I also can't put into words the pathological visceral hatred I have for pedophiles and rapists. If I could get away with murdering them, I would. I would never ever inflict the absolute nightmare I went through on any child. I got up and left. I came very close to the edge of suicide that day. I also immediately ended the relationship because I couldn't deal with the thought that the kids might be at risk because of me. It's now 21 years later and I'm tearing up typing this. Because of that experience, I have never sought therapist help again. I survive mentally, but it's not good survival. Not a judgment, you kind of train your brain not to judge, because you are seeking to understand and help. When you do those things, you can't simultaneously judge. We could all use a little more of that in real life, I suppose. I'll share this though. I do feel concerned about this recent phenomenon of young people I worked with self-diagnosing, sharing, and identifying very closely with mental illness, as if the pendulum quickly swung from "never, ever share your feelings" to "OMG, you're depressed." All of us are too. Life's challenges can be tough and they don't need a scientific-sounding label to be valid and real. You are not your diagnosis. We can find validation and support in healthier ways. Not a therapist but a patient. Me and my fiancé, at the time, went in to see if we could figure out how to make things work after he hit me. After our history came out and I divulged his infidelity etc., the therapist basically said no. There's no hope. You need to get help for yourself so you can get the courage to leave and end this. I was angry at the time, but both therapists knew there was no point as he was as screwed up as it gets. Two contexts come to mind. I often work with people in abusive relationships and it is incredibly common for people to go back to their abusive partners after leaving. Some studies show the average number of times someone goes back before leaving for good is 7 times. I know why people go back and I get that it's often a combination of manipulation, financial control, gaslighting, love, low self-esteem, fear, etc. But, man, it is hard to watch and appear neutral. I can say I am worried about their safety but I can't yell, "For fuck's sake, stop going back." What is it going to take? Like I want to. The other situation isn't really judging the person, it's more judging OCD. But OCD is weird. The infinitely weird ways it can show up are so funny and bizarre. Again, I would never judge a person for having the intrusive thoughts they have or doing the compulsions that are somehow linked in their mind to those obsessions, but I absolutely judge OCD and constantly marvel at how creative and weird the human brain can be. Okay, real therapist here. I got one. Some of my clients are shockingly bad at giving themselves credit, holy shit. Like they might get a nearly straight A GPA in a brutal major while battling depression, or overcome years of phobia and get behind the wheel again, or write a literal novel, or raise a kid as a single parent with low income, or build new relationships after being burned, or cope with OCD well enough to hold down a job. And they'll talk about themselves as if everyone on earth is better than them, as if their accomplishments are worthless. And I know it's because of depression or anxiety or another condition, but I'm often stunned by how differently I see them compared to how they see themselves. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe for more daily Reddit content.